Morning, eighth graders. Happy March 28th. I think it's March 28th. 27th. March 27th. This will be, I think, day 10 of our quarantine, our second weekend of doing distance learning. Today, our objective is to talk about Gettysburg, and I did decide we're not going to have any homework today, no Schoology lesson for you to go into, so enjoy your weekend, but do me a favor and make sure you watch this video about Gettysburg for me. In the wrong spot here. Let me scroll up. If you remember last time we were together, or last time we had a video, we were talking about the death of Thomas Jackson and the Battle of Chancellorsville. So we're ready for Gettysburg. At this point, General Lee was seeing opportunities and issues kind of at the same time. And he decided it was time to try again to cross into Union territory and attack. So remember, their goal was to stay defensive. In this instance, they're going to go on the offensive. So he's going to cross into Pennsylvania in June of 1863. At this point, the Union is led by a man named General Meade. And I might have mentioned the other day, I kind of think General Meade looks a little bit like Kermit the Frog. Without the beard, you shave it off and paint him green, he looks pretty Kermit the Frogish. Um, and we're talking about Pennsylvania in July. Hot, humid, just like our weather would be here around the 4th of July. So kind of keep that in mind, along with the wool uniforms that most of the men by 1863 are wearing. Now, Lee sees that if he doesn't get some significant victories, that every time they fight, even if he's getting victories, he's losing men, he's losing precious supplies. He needs some victories. He needs them now, and he sees this as a great opportunity. So fighting actually begins on July 1st, even though he crosses into Pennsylvania in June. And the fighting sort of begins by happenstance as a couple of young Confederate soldiers were walking around in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the Union, wearing Confederate uniforms. I believe the story goes they were looking for boots. And word traveled back to General Meade that Lee was in town. So the two armies are going to clash near Gettysburg, a huge battlefield, miles and miles and miles of battlefield. About 90,000 Union troops and 75,000 Confederates are going to get together here. 3 days of fighting. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about this fighting, but 3 days of fighting, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Now I want you to think about this. If a person is killed on July 1st, in the hot Pennsylvania July summer sun, what happens to their body by July 3rd? This is a horrifying thing that's going on here. It's seen as the turning point of the war because the Union is going to get a decisive victory that we really haven't seen very much. Other victories in the past were sort of question marks. They're victories, but not really decisive. By the end of the day on July 3rd, 1863, the Confederates were almost toast. They didn't have too many things going their way, so a guy named George Pickett, that's the picture of George Pickett that you see there. It's a guy's name, not what you do with your nose. Decided that he would volunteer 15,000 Confederate soldiers to attack the center of the Union lines. So they're going to run across, 15,000 men are going to run across an open field up a hill to attack tens of thousands of Union soldiers right in the center while they're under fire with heavy artillery. The Union is just blasting away at them, and they're getting picked to bits, hoping that they could break the Union lines. So the Union was sort of divided into 3 sections, the Union lines were, and Pickett, thinking if he could break them into 2, might cause them to overreact and maybe force them to run around crazy. Well, Pickett's charge might have been one of the bravest moments of the Civil War or one of the dumbest moments of the Civil War. Pickett actually has success in breaking the Union line very briefly, but then is repulsed or captured or repelled. And the scene after Pickett's charge, you can see there on number 2, is described as ghastly heaps of dead men. So the Union wins, and ironically enough, July 4th, being the day after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union wakes up ready to fight some more, only to find out General Meade finds out that Lee has taken his men once again back into retreat into the safety of the Confederacy. And Meade makes probably the same mistake that General George McClellan had made, excuse me, after Antietam, and he doesn't pursue. So once again, the Confederates, the war's not over. It's 1863. The war will last for another 2 years, but from this point on, things really seem to be in favor of the Union. If you look at the casualty figures there, 23,000 killed or wounded Union soldiers, 28,000 killed or wounded Confederate soldiers. That's 50,000 men in 3 days of fighting. Gettysburg will be known as the single bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It's not the bloodiest day of fighting. That day is reserved for the Battle of Antietam, which still holds true today, with almost 25,000 casualties in one day. But this is 3 days of fighting. In fact, I pulled this up. I'll show you this. This is kind of cool. This is a list of the bloodiest battles in American history, and I don't know what their numbers here. These are not very accurate, but if you look on here, the Battle of Gettysburg, even still today, even after World War I and World War II, like St. Mihiel and Elsborn Ridge, the Battle of the Bulge, Elsborn Ridge, Gettysburg is still the third bloodiest battle in American history. Antietam drops down here. Here we've got the Battle of the Wilderness. You know, the American Civil War had some nasty, Spotsylvania Courthouse had some nasty type battles. In fact, so bloody that I found this article too. This was kind of fun. So many Civil War soldiers were killed at Gettysburg, they're still finding remains in 1996. So 40,000 men were casualties. We just saw 50,000. Bloodiest clash of the war. Thousands were buried in mass graves. Corpses later exhumed, and exhumed means dug back up and reburied in a military cemetery. And farmers are still finding stuff in their fields today. So it's a crazy thing. Now, this is another clip from the movie Gods and Generals that we watched. And this is Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, who actually, he was from Maine, led a group of men. He was a school teacher before he became a general. So let's watch this clip. I think it's a couple minutes. It shows us what one of the charges on one of the flanks or the sides at the Battle of Gettysburg looked like. We'll see if it'll play for us. Well, maybe we won't see if it'll play for us. What if I do this? Ooh, make it big.
Half my men are down. Most of the rest are wounded. The left is too thin.
How are we fixed for ammunition?
It's almost gone.
Sir, we're running out. You don't have much left to shoot with. Some of the boys got nothing at all.
Sir, what do we do for ammunition?
Sir, my boys have picked up red muskets and they're firing back with them.
Sir, we ought to pull out.
No, we can't do that.
We can't hold them again, sir. You know that.
Well, if we don't, they go on by and over the hill and the whole flank caves in. Sir, here they come. Well, we can't run away. If we stay here, we can't shoot. So let's fix bayonets. We'll have the advantage of moving down the hill. They got to be tired, the Revs. They got to be close to the end if we are. So fix bayonets. Ellis, you take the left wing. I'll take the right. I want a right wheel forward of the whole regiment.
What, do you mean charge?
Yes, but here's what we do. We're going to charge swinging down the hill. Just like we pulled back this left side of the regiment, now we're going to swing it down. We swing like a door. We're going to sweep them down the hill just as they come up. Understand? Does everybody understand?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Ellis, you take the left wing, and when I give the command, I want the whole regiment to go forward, swinging down to the right.
All right, sir. Fine.
Move. right wheel.
Right wheel!
Charge.
You get an idea of the chaos of the scene. This is called a split rail fence. So this is what we'd have barbed wire fences today, but this is what men would have had to come across and get over, which would be very difficult with horses. Or in some instances, there's some pretty good stories of men getting backed into corners like this with cannon. Every time you fire a cannon, it backs up 3 or 4 feet from the recoil or the kick of the cannon. So you almost fire in retreat, or you have to continue to roll them forward. So you get here with a cannon, you can't carry them over. You have to somehow dismantle the fence. They're pretty well interwoven. This is called grape shot. So instead of just a cannonball, you might have a canister that looks like this. Well, here's an actual example of one that's filled with these grape-sized pieces of lead. So when it explodes, it fires out in all directions, and we would call that shrapnel today. It does lots of damage to lots of people. Just some information. The number of wounded on the field of Gettysburg was 10 to 1 compared to the number of people living in town. There were 40 Confederate field hospitals alone. This is crazy. Hundreds of people came from all around to help bury the dead and clean up the aftermath. After the burial, the Women's Association paid thousands of Confederate soldiers to be dug up and returned to the South. We see some more scenes, probably Matthew Brady scenes, the death and carnage of the battle. 7,000 dead men and 3,000 horses accounted for nearly 6 million pounds of carcasses to dispose of in the heat of the July summer. This is kind of a neat story. The 9th Massachusetts Artillery Battery lost 80 of its 88 horses at a place called the Trossel Farm, which you can still visit. This farmhouse still exists at Gettysburg National Battlefield Monument today. But on July 2nd. So they got backed into this corner here. Now I'm going to point out 2 things. First of all, the house still stands, and the curator of the museum out at DeSoto, his name is Dean Knutson. Dean used to be the curator of the Battlefield Museum at Gettysburg. He actually lived in this house when he worked there, called the Trossel House. Now, also, look over here. You can barely see it, but right there above my pointer is a little spot on the barn, and the barn still exists today. That's a cannonball hole, and that hole is still in that barn today. Here's another picture of the same barn and all of the dead horses. There's the hole. Gettysburg residents complained of the smell of death all the way until October, and they used peppermint oil over their noses on a cloth to cover the stench. Some dead soldiers were lucky enough to have their bloody clothing removed, washed, dried, and returned to their body for proper burial. So people were very respectful of the dead as much as they could be. Here's an example of what people saw. As we reached the crest of a never-to-be-forgotten scene burst upon us. A great basin lay before us, full of smoke and fire, and literally swarming with riderless horses and fighting, fleeing, and pursuing men. The air was saturated with sulphurous fumes of battle and was ringing with the shouts and groans of the combatants, the wild cries of charging lines and the rattle of musketry, the booming of artillery and the shrieks of the wounded were orchestral accompaniments of a scene like very hell itself. But fascinating as this terrible scene was, we had no time to spend upon it. Bloody work was ready for us at our very feet. So if you can imagine picturing that scene and heading into it as a soldier. Later, they would purchase land near the battlefield to bury the soldiers. Many had to be dug up and moved to Gettysburg National Cemetery. Contracts were made to pay $1.59 for each body that was dug up and moved to the new cemetery. So I guess if you wanted some gruesome, gory money, and if eggs are $6 a dozen, I suppose probably a lot of people were willing to do the work. They were still unburied coffins stacked when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address later on. And that'll move us into Monday, into the Battle of Vicksburg, which, notice the date. So Gettysburg was July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Vicksburg is July 4th. Two different places, and we'll talk more about that later on.